Well, hello, my name's Craig and I work at the University of Glasgow in the School of Cardiovascular Science and Metabolic Health. And I'd like to talk to you today about science and the metaverse. Now, it's a science conference, so I don't need to tell you what science is, but I may need to explain to some of you what the metaverse is. Or maybe I can't explain what the metaverse is, but maybe try to define it, because lots of people have different definitions of what the metaverse, omniverse, viveverse, whatever kind of verse you might be thinking of, what does it actually mean? Well, if we think back almost 30 years ago when the internet first became regularly available, we had what we could call the web version 1, and that was where we brought together all the information sites. And then there was web version 2, which was the information plus all the social media. And we could think of the metaverse as being web version 3. That would be the information sites, social media, but also the Internet of Things, all of the devices that are capable of being connected to the internet. Now that creates quite a complex ecosystem, if we could call it that. And one thing that the metaverse will try to help us to do is to make it easier for us to create assets, scenes, anything you like. Create things within a virtual environment, within the metaverse. So how can we do science in the metaverse? Well, my particular interest is in using virtual reality and augmented reality. But virtual reality is not the metaverse. It's no more the metaverse than your phone or your computer is the internet. Your VR headset is really only an interface into the metaverse. Now, there are many different types of VR headsets available, and they range in prices. You can get some relatively cheap ones, and by cheap I mean maybe around about £350 mark, like the Meta Quest, but these can range all the way up to £1,250 for a Vive Pro, and there are some very, very more expensive models. But these will constantly come down in price and will make it more available for people to purchase headsets and experience some of this virtual reality, metaverse, Viveverse, whatever we want to call it. So if we think of the metaverse as being that web version 3.0, the connection of everything, with the possibility of using VR headsets as a window into those virtual worlds, the next problem to think about is, how do we do science in the metaverse? Now, the science I'm interested in tends to be concentrated around blood vessels and physiology, and trying to create models of real cells and real tissues in a virtual world. Now, how would we do that? Well, typically, I have used laser scanning microscopes. And these microscopes use multiple lasers to scan a cell or a tissue and create a 3D model. Now, it's all very well having a 3D digital model, but the question is, how do you get that 3D digital model into something that can be useful or used or visualized within the metaverse? Now, the technique that we use is to try to extract out structures from our biological tissues once we've created the 3D model. Now, what this scene shows is a block of tissue. In this case, it's electron microscopy rather than laser scanning microscopy. But what we've collected are 600 slices through the spinal cord, a very, very tiny piece of the spinal cord. And this, just start the video. These slices are all perfectly aligned right down the depth. So you can think of it as a digital block of data. Now, within that data set, there are nerve cells, nerve cell bodies, there are axons, there are all sorts of glia. These are the the types of cells that keep everything together. And in this particular data set, there's also a really nice blood vessel, a capillary, covered in pericytes. What we would typically do is we would take all of that data and we would turn it into a block, like a volumetric block. Now that volumetric block is far too solid to see through. So what we need to do is to try to pull out the structures that we might be interested in. And here we see the myelinated axons. These are the long processes that you would expect to find in nerve cells. Now, we would then extract out the cell bodies that you see in blue here, and even the mitochondria that you see in green wiggling around, and we can create a 3D model. So there's a 3D model of an aspect or parts of the structure of the spinal cord. Imagine what it would be like to walk around inside that spinal cord. Now, we've made lots of different models like that enable our students and even members of the general public to look around inside cells. Now, you may have heard of Sketchfab, and Sketchfab is a website where you will find over 5 million 3D models. These 3D models can be visualized on your computer or on your phone. They can be downloaded in some cases, and in some cases they can be purchased as well. So this has created a massive collection of 3D models, or what we call 3D assets. And here's one such asset that I've created, which is a protein with a drug bound onto the protein. Now, if I had a VR headset connected to my computer, I could see what it would look like inside that individual protein. The next model I'll show you here is two cells. There's a yellow cell, which we call a pericyte, and a red cell, which is the endothelial cell. And we're interested in how these cells connect and how they communicate. And by building the 3D model and looking inside it and looking around it, we can get a better understanding of the interaction between these cells. Now, everybody seems to be interested in viruses these days, and if you wanted to look inside a virus, here's one that you could find on our website as well. This is the Glasgow Life Science Sketchfab page. And finally, I would show you some nerves that we have constructed. And this is what pain looks like. These are the nerve cells that are involved in conducting pain, the pain signal. So we've got lots of models that have been extracted from real biological experiments, but really we want to see these in VR. So how would we do that? Well, here we have our student, Con, and he's a master's student. And what he did was he spent a lot of last summer working with that EM block and outlining by hand all the various structures that we were interested in. Now, he doesn't have to do everything by hand. There are artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms that will help us to pull out specific structures, but these tend to be the structures that are relatively easy to see, and the computer algorithms can pull them out. For some of the more difficult structures, we actually have to go in and trace round them, colour them in, and extract them. And here what we see is the cell body in blue with some of those axons in brown and purple. And if we look inside the cell, we see the nucleus in green and the mitochondria in blue. Okay, so that's a 3D model within the computer. But then what we can do is we can take that data and we can put it into a games engine like Unity. Now what that enables us to do is to then put a virtual reality camera inside the scene. So now what we see is Con looking around the VR scene of the same data. And you'll see the green here we're showing as the cell bodies, the pink tubes that you see there are those myelinated axons that we talked about. And the red blood cells, well, I've just drawn them in just to make it look nice, but you can use them as stepping stones to climb up the data. And we've also put some ramps into the data so that the user can climb up. And you'll see here Con starts to move himself up through the data and he gets higher and higher in the data set. And what's incredible is that when some people use this data set and they get to the top of the ramp and look down, there's a real feeling of height And if I ask somebody to take a step off the highest ramp, they're often quite reluctant to do so. So that's us being able to take data from EM microscope data through to creating a 3D model, making a virtual reality scene, and then enabling somebody to wander around that scene. And it's not as difficult as you might expect. So what does the metaverse promise for us? Well, it promises easier access to virtual worlds. I am not a computer scientist. My day job is Professor of Physiology, but I have been able to relatively easily, I would say, create virtual worlds. The data has to go through many, many different software packages, but that is becoming simpler. So the universal scene descriptions that companies are working on is enabling file transfers between the various computer software programs, which makes things much easier. I've mentioned Web3, which is bringing together data, people, the Internet of Things. And this means that we can now collaborate, teach, and learn within virtual environments. So we can study our science in the metaverse. And the next question is, well, we should be researching the metaverse. We should be thinking about how can we use these virtual worlds, not only to understand the structures that we're interested in, but how could we do new types of research in the metaverse, in virtual worlds, that would not be possible in the normal world. I think the future is very, very exciting. And I look forward to maybe seeing you in a virtual world sometime at maybe one of the demonstrations that you might come to at the University of Glasgow. So thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Science Festival. See you again.